Hello, and welcome to Bind Variables and Performance. I am Walter Kudo, a software developer manager in Embarcadero. Today I hope I can help shed some light on bind variables and how they can help you write better SQL. I'll start off by saying that there are two good reasons to use bind variables. One is security. Bind variables are the best way to prevent SQL injection. The other is performance. Today I'll be concentrating on the performance gains of using bind variables. Today I'll take you through the excuses people may use when trying to explain why they don't use bind variables. I'll then explain what bind variables are, show some examples of them being used, and show how they are more performant than equivalent SQL that does not use bind variables. I hope to show you that there are no valid reasons not to consider using bind variables where appropriate in your SQL code. Okay, let's see what some of the excuses for not using bind variables are. So these are examples of some of the excuses that people may use on why they don't use bind variables. Some people think bind variables are too difficult to use, and that concatenating strings with possibility of embedded quotes and format considerations is easier than handling bind variables. I'm not sure I understand how they come up with that conclusion, but some people do think that is the truth. Others think that the code they write never has the need for bind variables to gain performance. They think that they write the most performant SQL and there's nothing else that can be done to make that performant. Personally, on this page, I think the only valid excuse is the one that says that you don't know what bind variables are. To solve that excuse, I'll go and start explaining what bind variables are. So what are bind variables? Well, the easiest way to think of a bind variable is to say that it's like a parameter for SQL. Just like you use parameters in your SQL functions or SQL procedures. Bind variables allow you to use parameters for your SQL statements. That may sound like a simplistic explanation, but basically that is all that there is to them. So far they don't sound that difficult, do they? So why don't we proceed to show how we can use bind variables to see if that's where it becomes difficult to use them. So how do I use them? Just before we start on that, as a note, from this point on, all the examples would be using Oracle. Other platforms do have bind variable support, like SQL Server, but for this presentation, I'll be concentrating on Oracle. So basically, SQL with bind variables look just like regular SQL, except that they contain placeholders instead of literals. In the first bullet point, I show a typical example of an Oracle statement using a bind variable. In Oracle, you can use bind variables in your PL SQL code or via the driver. Applications that handle bind variable executions will give you some kind of UI to be able to enter the data to use in executing the statement. We will show bind variables used in PL SQL and via the application. And the application that we'll be using today is DBArtisan from Embarcadero. Okay, so for the PL SQL demo, we'll do a simple little query that inserts data into a table, not using bind variables. So we'll up DBArtisan. We're already connected to an Oracle 11G. And we'll just proceed to type in our test data. Okay. So just to go briefly over the PL SQL here. It's just an anonymous block. I'm creating a dynamic statement that inserts data that takes the loop variable and inserts it into the first value, and the second column it inserts 10 times the loop variable. And it does this for 10 times. We will then show that the data did get inserted, and we'll truncate the data just so that we're back to the same state as we were before we executed. So let us run this and see that it works and produces the results that we think it does. And there we go. So the data was inserted as we expected. So now we're going to look at this piece of code and say, well, how would I change this to bind variables? And how long would it take me to do so? So let's just try that out. So the first thing I'll do is change this to be the actual bind variable. So there we go, there's my new string. And since the string never changes, I don't have to keep it here. I'll just bring it back outside here. Okay, so now I have my string. So I have my two placeholders here, and it does the same thing. So now I need to get this execute immediate to bind to these variables. So how do I do that? That must be complicated. No, it's not. There's actually just a simple addition, adding the using clause here. And there we go. This should work exactly the same as the previous PL/SQL code. Now just test that out. We'll run it again. Make sure we did everything right. And lo and behold, there we go. We got the exact same data with using bind variables. So does this code look any more complicated than the other code? No, it looks just as simple, and if not even more simple to read. I'll just paste back the original code in here, and we can compare the two. So it's the exact same number of lines. Syntax doesn't look any harder to read or to type out, and they do the exact same piece of work. So there's really nothing difficult about bind variables at all. Okay, so now let's move over to show bind variables used by the application as opposed to PL/SQL. Okay, let's open up a new iSQL window here, and we'll type away a similar statement. We'll go back here. We're going to use this statement in our application. And then we're just going to have a select statement to make sure that we did indeed insert the data. And we're going to truncate the table as we did in the previous example. So this looks similar to the PL/SQL code, except it's not in a loop. We're just doing it once. And it's not in PL/SQL. There's nothing here saying what to put for these variables. So I'll hit execute in Artisan and see what happens. So it had the Artisan decided to pop up a dialog because it needs input before it can finish executing the statement. Over here it's showing me what statement it's trying to run and what the parameters are, and up here it's giving me the list parameters for me to provide it input. So I'm going to say that the parameters are both integers. They're both input. I'm going to put in 1 and 10. And I'm going to press OK. I extended the row, and now it's giving me the dialog for the second statement, showing me the statement down here, saying that it needs input for that statement. The variable name is ID. And I'm going to say it's an integer, and I know I entered 1 in the first one, so I'm going to put 1 here and press OK. And there we go. So we see that it inserted the row, and the statement's executed with input from the user. So even that doesn't look that hard. It looks very simple to use, and if your application supports bind variables, it's some kind of UI to show you so that you can enter in the input for your statements. So far, we've shown you that there really is nothing difficult about bind variables, and there is no good reason not to use them, because they're not hard to use at all. So next, we'll talk about the performance gains. So why would bind variables give me performance gains over my regular SQL? Basically, each time a SQL statement is sent to the database, an exact text match is performed to see if the statement has already been executed and if it's in the shared pool. If no matching statement is found, the database performs a hard parse of that statement. Otherwise, a soft parse is done. So hard parses are expensive, as it does all the processing to come up with the best execution plan, while the soft parse has very little processing to do, as the execution plan already exists in the cache. As you saw in our example, by using bind variables, the exact same statement was executed for each iteration of the loop. The statement was exactly the same for each loop. And thus, a hard parse was only done for the first iteration and a soft parse for the rest. This is the key to understanding bind variable performance. But some of you might say, wait a minute, Walter, aren't you forgetting that when I do a hard parse, I find the best execution plan for the input given, and if I use bind variables, I'll only get an estimate of what the best plan is for the input? Isn't it better to have the best execution plan? Well, that is a good question. And the answer to that depends on what price I paid for the hard parse. If my execution plan tends to be mostly the same for most input, then I waste my time hard parsing each statement, and the bind variables would have been more performant. But it is true that in certain inputs that you might cause wildly different execution plans. Then for those cases, bind variables may not be the best to use. That doesn't mean that you don't use bind variables at all. It only means that you need to know the possible execution plans for your SQL and which ones are appropriate to use bind variables. So enough talk. I need to show you guys that you can get quite a big performance gain from using bind variables over regular it's dynamic SQL, even in our simple example. So let's go back to Artisan. Okay, so here we go back to our simple example. So we need to add timing to this. So timer. So I'll just add timing code here. Do the same thing for both statements. And then I need to output this. And we'll add this output to our other ones, to our other PL SQL statement. And there we go. So we added a timer, and we're going to output how long it took to finish the loop. Now 10 is probably a little too short, so we'll add a few more. We'll say 1,000. We don't need to see the data. And there we go. So this will be our timing test. So let's execute that and see what we get. So that's amazing. So we got almost a 5 times performance difference between the two. We got just under 0.1 seconds with bind variables and just under 0.5 seconds without bind variables. Let's run that one more time just to make sure there wasn't a glitch. And we see again the numbers are about the same. Just under a second with bind variables, just under 0.1 seconds with bind variables, just under 0.5 seconds without bind variables. Now, some of you may be saying, but wait a minute, the two PL SQL statements aren't exactly the same. The one without bind variables is generating the statement each time, while this one just generates the string once. So that could be the reason for some of the performance. And you could be right. That is a difference. I think it's valid a performance gain. But just to satisfy that for this data, we'll just copy this, take out the default, put it in the loop, and now we have 3 tests here. The first one using bind variables in the most efficient way. The second one using bind variables but stupidly generating the string each time. And the last one not using bind variables. So let's see what the timings are here. As you can see, it's not much of a difference. Just under 1 second with bind variables. Just over 0.1 seconds with bind variables, but with the string being generated each time in the loop, and 0.5 seconds. So the most of the performance is obviously from the hard parse versus soft parse, not from anything else that we did to the statement. Run it one more time just to make sure the numbers are correct. As you can see, it is pretty consistent. That bind variables, no matter which version you are, it's around 0.1 seconds, and without bind variables, it's around 0.5 seconds. So that's a pretty dramatic performance difference between the two cases. And it should be clear now that there really is no reason to avoid using bind variables. There's some cases that you can get really big performance gains over similar SQL. And if you look at what we wrote here, there really is no difference in how difficult it is to write SQL in either case. So there's the performance gains. Okay. So maybe we'll talk about some do's and don'ts now that we've seen that bind variables are easy to understand and easy to use. So what are some of the do's and don'ts? Firstly, you need to understand your statement and its possible execution plans. This will determine which SQL would benefit from bind variable usage. Understand that just because there are some input that would require hard parses does not mean bind variables cannot be used at all. You can have logic that will use bind variables for the input that makes sense to use bind variables, otherwise it will generate the SQL and execute that instead. With this, you will get the most performance out of your code. A performance tuning tool can help you with the task of determining how well a SQL statement is running. If you're interested in learning about this, I would recommend you attend the session right after this one called Solving Performance Problems in Oracle DB. Secondly, if you use bind variables in scripts and take advantage of your application's bind variable handling, don't use driver or application-specific extensions if you care about being portable. You don't want to spend all this time investing in your scripts that use bind variables that you run in your application, just so that you have to redo them if you have to use another application or have to use another tool. So let's show you an example of what I mean about this. So we'll open another iSQL window in DBArtisan, and I'll write an interesting little function. So here I'm getting a bind variable, and then the same bind variable shows up 3 times in this anonymous block. So it looks like I'm taking this bind variable's input, multiplying by itself, and putting it back into that bind variable. So let us run this in DBArtisan. So if you look at DBArtisan, has correctly seen that there's only one bind variable, and it's giving us a statement and asking us what the input is. So I'll say it's an integer, and it's in, and it's an input-output. And I'll pick a value of 3. So I should expect 9 coming back from the application. And there we go. 9 did come back from the application. So this is interesting and very compact way of doing this function. But the problem here is that this is something that only works using the Oracle OCI driver. So it's a feature in the OCI driver that many applications that are targeted just against the OCI driver sometimes use in their code. So I'll switch here over to the JDBC driver, and let's see what the JDBC driver does with this statement. There we go. It looks like it's working. It finds one variable. Everything's going fine so far. I'm going to say it's an in-out, and that the value is 3. So far everything looks perfectly fine. I'm going to press OK, and I get an error message that it's missing an in or an out parameter at index 2. A little bit cryptic, but basically the JDBC driver is actually thinking that these 3 guys are actually completely different bind variables. So this is not supported, and in PL/SQL you cannot do this either. So this is basically just the OCI driver that can handle this SQL. So let's go over back to the OCI driver just for a bit and say, well, how would I write this so that it's not specific? Well, it's not that hard. It looks a bit more complex. But I'll declare an in value variable, say it's numeric. And then I'll say that in value is assigned the input bind variable. And then I'm going to select inval times inval into an output variable and reflected off sysdual. So this is a little more complex than the other statement, but equally valid. So we'll run that and see what happens. So now I have two variables to bind to. So I'm going to say that they're both integers, and the first one is an input, and I'll put a value of 3, and I'll say the second one is an out. So I don't need to put a value for that, and press OK. And there we go. We get the exact same execution using the OCI driver. So let's switch over to JDBC driver, see if it likes this better. And has the same response. I'll just put the same values in. So I'm expecting 9 back from the JDBC driver as well. And there we go. So now you've written SQL that's not dependent on a driver or application, and you can easily move this from one place to the next. That's the end of my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions that anybody has. Thank you for listening.
So you can see them as you're typing. Does it do completion for you or give you selection lists?
Yes. So as you're typing, if it finds a match for, say, you typed in sys dot, and it has it in its cache a match for a list of object types for sys, it would show you a list, and as you type, the list would shrink, or you could pick one off the list and continue typing. For parameters, or like if you're in a where clause, same thing. So if you're in the where clause, you start typing the where clause, it starts giving you hints on what columns could show up in the where clause.
Great. And then Dubakar, I'm sorry if I'm destroying your name. He put a couple questions in there about bind variables as it relates to OLTP and not data warehouse, or bind variables not good with histograms.
Yeah, it's true. I touched upon this in the presentation. There's if the input if the input can change your execution plans drastically, then it's not something that bind variables can do, because it would just make assumptions that may not be correct for your input. So you do need to know your SQL, or you do need to have a performance tool that can tune your SQL and tell you what it's doing for the input that it's getting. So yeah, there are cases that you would not use bind variables. You just wouldn't get the performance gains. You actually might get a actually opposite. You might actually get it running slower.
Okay, and there's Paul's putting a message which looks like it's again more related to either Delphi or C++ side, client-side programming, but maybe it relates to a bind variable or a parameterized SQL statement. Are they equivalent? I'm not a SQL expert.
Yeah, they're equivalent. So yeah, anything that's a placeholder that needs you to provide input to the driver as are bind variables under that definition. So yeah, you can do it like in Oracle's case. There's PL/SQL. You can do the bind variables within PL/SQL, or as with most other platforms, the drivers have support for bind variables. So the FireDAC and ADO, they're drivers with bind variable support, so they would do it. The only difference is drivers to, like, especially JDBC, ODBC type drivers in ADO, they inherently in their generic concept of a driver have bind variables. So there are some platforms that do not have bind variables, but the driver still provides you bind variables via the driver. In those cases, you do not get the performance gains you do from places like Oracle and SQL Server, because what they end up doing is variable substitution in the back. But for your code that you write generically, it's nice. So it's not that you shouldn't use them. It's just keep in mind that bind variables to the driver does not mean that the platform supports bind variables.
Okay, Pierre said binds are fine with inserts. We've had performance problems with bind variables when doing selects. Are there any best practices for select statements?
I think it's, yeah, the inserts definitely do get the largest benefits, because usually they don't have a where clause that can change the execution plan. So they are very, they behave very well using bind variables. Select statements, again, you would need a performance tool to tell you. So you'd have to have the bind variable version, the non-bind variable version, and have the performance tool tell you if you're getting the gains that you think you're getting. Because especially if you have joins or you have a complex where clause or like statements, bind variables don't like statements because those definitely affect your performance. So things like that, you definitely need a performance tool. That's the best practice. Just don't blindly think that bind variables is the silver bullet. They're just a tool, and in the cases that they work, it's dramatic change. In the cases that they work more or less, they give you a pretty good performance gain. For the cases where they don't work, they actually hurt you. So I mean, I think the rule of thumb out there for most people is that if you're considering converting SQL from dynamic SQL without bind variables to dynamic SQL with bind variables, that you should not expect more than a 30% gain in performance. So if it takes you a cost of what you would consider cost of more than 30% of your good time, then it's probably not worthwhile. So just keep that in mind. Don't expect more than 30%. If you get more than that, that's great, but don't expect more than that.
And you mentioned performance tools. Does that tie into DB Optimizer? That's part of the studio?
Yeah, that ties into DB Optimizer, which we started as part of the studio. It has very good handling of variables and execution plans. I've used it mainly on Oracle and SQL Server. It does support other platforms, but it's Oracle and SQL Server support I've found amazing.
Okay. Sebastian, sort of two pieces in the Q&A. He's wondering about bind variables and security concerns. Maybe where you're
Yeah,
Something like that.
I touched that at the beginning. That it is one of the reasons to use bind variables, SQL injection. Um, we do actually have a video online about that. It does show dynamic SQL, I think, through Oracle and SQL injection. So that would be the best example that to show. But it's for bind variables, since since you don't have this formatting of strings and building your statements, the possibility of SQL injection is not there. You're directly binding via the driver to the server the value. That's is one of the thoughts behind it. If you do have a statement that you can use bind variables for, you also get that added bonus. They don't get the SQL injection problems you do with the other version of the statement. But if you have your email there, I can see if I can find the. I know I saw it. It's recently on our website.
Stop the injection, the do's and don'ts of dynamic SQL with Rick Moreland, maybe on.
Yeah. That's the video I was talking about. So it's